So I'm going to transition out of the Middle East, touch a little bit into Russia. And before I get into Russia, it's always a good idea to discuss communism. So this form of communism, of course, is going to come from the Soviet Union, Russia, USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, and some of the key points. So as you take your notes, I guess some of the key players are of the Russian communism. Karl Marx, of course, is the creator of the theory. Marx and Engels, back in the 1800s, come up with a theory of communism. And the Russians, or Vladimir Lenin, not John Lennon, Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky, and a group of revolutionaries, the vanguard of the Russian communists, are going to take that theory and try to apply it, at least elements of the theory, and apply it in Russia. So if you know anything about Russian history, we're talking 1917. And in 1917, of course, World War I is going on, and Russia is ruled by a czar. So a czar, Nicholas, whose last name is Romanov, is the last of the great czars. And a czar is basically an emperor or a king for the Russian Empire. And he gets involved in World War I, is not really a military leader, but is very influential in how the Russians are going to fight the war, and they will receive the most casualties of any country in World War I. And of course, World War I starts in 1914. By 1917, it's just a fiasco for the Russians. And Lenin and Trotsky and the revolutionaries are going to do something about it. So they eventually are going to hold the revolutionaries and their followers are going to overtake the royal palace, and they're going to capture the royal family, including Nicholas, the Tsar, and his family. And they're eventually going to execute the family, the royal family, and then start to basically implement their belief in socialism and communism. So we'll kind of get to that. That's just the backstory. All right, so those are some of the main creators of the modern communist state. Okay, if I can get this thing to work. There we go. All right, so for testing purposes, then you probably need to know these main evils. According to the theory, capitalism, our system, or the United States system, in Karl Marx's view and Joseph Engels' view, has flaws. And these are kind of the flaws that are listed: private property, profit motive, competition. All right. And according to the theory, capitalism will create this gulf of wealth, the haves and the have-nots. And it's that disparity of wealth that troubled Karl Marx and Engels. The gulf, and this last bullet E there says the gulf between rich and poor is exploited by the free enterprise system. Common usage capitalism free market refers to an economic system in which all or most of the means of production are privately owned. So factories and businesses are owned by citizens privately and operated where the investment of the capital and the production, distribution, and prices of commodities, goods, and services are determined mainly in a free market rather than by the state. The means of production have generally been operated in pursuit of profit. So that's the capitalist system, the free market system, right? And it's that private property, that profit motive, and that competition that the theorists have problems with, believing that it's the pursuit of profit that really and the pursuit of capital or money through competition that separates the wealthy, the rich, and the poor. All right, so that's ultimately the backdrop of these communist states, is that disparity. Now, you can say today there's Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. In the United States, it's kind of ironic that in the United States, we are currently the most, or have the biggest economic disparity than we ever have had in our history. And, there's theories as to why we are where we are right now. But, some of Marx's theory here rings true if we look at our current system. Now, if I would have said that in the 1950s, I'd be fired. And what I'm about to say is that the theory itself is an interesting theory that inherently people will take care of themselves if given the opportunity. And that's kind of the backdrop of this theory is you don't need a government to dictate life. And in this system, in this theory, ultimately the end result is the government goes away and people will take care of themselves. The problem is the theory is one thing. I mean, it's an interesting theory, and it's kind of a utopian theory. But the implementation of the theory is where there's been problems, both in Russia and in China, and I'll get to that. All right, so here's some terms you're going to have to know. The proletariat. So in Marx's theory, you have two classes of citizen: the working class, called the proletariat, and the owners of the means of production, called the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie. Right. So the bourgeois are the masters of the proletariat, and basically they dictate life for the working class, right? And that, in Marx's theory, that is not a good thing. It says the workers, in this bottom paragraph, the workers were really just a commodity, something useful that can be turned into profit. The workers sold their labor to the bourgeois at full value, while they received in payment only a portion of what they had produced. The surplus value would therefore go back to the owners, right? And on its face, again, that kind of makes sense. You, for those of you that have a job, are providing your labor to wherever you work. And in the process, you're paid a wage. And that wage is not nearly what you're worth, if that makes sense. So your full value, you never really potentially reach in this system. However, and the surplus, so anything that is earned by that company above your wage is the surplus. And that surplus, rather than coming back to you who is providing the labor, is actually going to the bourgeois or the owners. So on its face, again, it makes sense. Now, I put those pictures on here only because of the backstory. So remember the Romanov family, the Tsar, and that's during the war, Nicholas was gone quite often. So his wife, the Tsarina, really controlled or was in charge of Russia while he was gone. Well, one of her main advisors is the guy in the upper left. And so he was incredibly influential in the life of the Tsarina. His name is Rasputin or Rasputin. And he was kind of a mystic. And you just kind of look at him and see that he's kind of mystical. And he had a drastic influence on the Tsarina. Now, they had a son that was a hemophiliac. He had a bleeding disorder. And Rasputin claimed that, he could help cure their son. And in the process, won over the Tsarina and became just this really controversial figure in Russian history. Now, the gal in the right-hand corner, of course, if you don't know, is Anastasia. So Disney has an animated version of the story of Anastasia, and I only put it on here because that's the backdrop of this communism, the communist revolution. When they overthrow the royal family and they take them into a field and execute them, the myth is that Anastasia survives. I don't know how they depicted it at Disney, but some of the storylines are that she um, played dead or acted like she was dead and hid under some of her family members. But eventually, will make her way to Europe, and during her life, will realize that she's actually a Romanov and the heir to the throne of Russia, and will come back and save the country. And that's the depiction of her in Disney. And then you see Rasputin looks interestingly a lot like he did in real life. Of course, that was just a myth. In actuality, it's a much more devastating story, but that's what that story is based off of during this timeline. All right, back to Marx and communism. Class struggle. So according to Marx, because of the means of production being controlled by private citizens, leads to a class system. And he says that throughout history, there's been this struggle between the rich and the poor, or the owners and the workers, or the slave and the master, and the serf. Serf is another name for a Russian slave, against the landlord. And in our case, the worker versus the bourgeois, or the owners. And each time there's a struggle, and throughout our history, there's been conflict between the workers, the working class, and those that own the means of production. And his theory says, throughout each time there's a clash, they reach a higher level or a higher stage. And eventually, the highest stage is when the workers actually defeat the bourgeois, and this classless society will be created. And this classless society, according to Marx, is called socialism. So you hear socialism a lot in our today's politics in the United States. And they throw the word around there like, oh, we're turning into a socialist country. And it's rather comical to me, just because in our capitalist system, it is very, very difficult to be able to change it into a completely socialist society. However, there are elements in our society that already exist that revolve around the socialist model. Social Security is a socialist system where the government takes your money over your years of you working, and when you reach a certain age, you don't have to work anymore, and you get that money back from the government and pays your wage basically as you reach retirement. Well, that's a socialist concept where the government is doing a greater good for all of its citizens. So you never hear that argument that we already have socialist elements within our society. But and some of the best economies in the world have those elements of socialism. And Norway, Finland, Sweden, those countries, they have free healthcare. They have, well, it's not free, but you know what I mean. Higher taxes, so that you have free healthcare, free college as a citizen of that country. Right. So those examples are out there. But I digress. All right, and then communism. And again, this is another thing that most people don't realize, but communism, according to the Marxist theory anyway, is the ultimate end result. So you reach this stage of socialism, and then in this basically stateless society is going to evolve. And the end result really of communism is that the government, for the most part, can dissipate, and the people themselves will take care of each other and set up, like I said, it's kind of utopian's theory. But the people themselves will own the means of production and determine for themselves who needs what, and and create this new social order. All right, everything that is used in producing goods should be owned by the community, not the individual or not the state. So common ownership is not going to be misused because they're not going to exploit themselves. All right, the theory believes that the owners exploit the workers. So if the workers actually own the means of production, they're not going to exploit themselves. Common ownership would cause all classes except the proletariat to disappear. So you all become one. Again, utopian, but on its face, that's an interesting theory. Everybody takes care of each other. We don't need the government. The government goes away, and so the Russians try to set up communities based off of this model, and those communities happen to be called Soviets. So the Soviet Union was basically this country of these small pockets of Soviet communities that were supposed to be taking care of each other or taking care of themselves. Now, ultimately, what happened in this theory, in Russia anyway, is that the communists became, the political party became the upper class. They became the bourgeois. That is what has been a failure both in Russia and China in the theory, is that they don't eliminate the class, the upper class. The political party members become the upper class, and that's the way it still is in Russia and in China, for that matter. All right, so here's where it takes a dark turn, and this really, the only reason it takes a dark turn is this is how Lenin and the Russian revolutionaries are going to implement it. All right, so the doctrine teaches that communism would be reached through violent seizure of political power. All right, so the violent seizure of political power is the overthrowing of the royal family in Russia. Right, check the box. Lenin and the boys basically took power. The name of their political party was the Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks have this violent revolution. They take over. And it says, number 2 says, if communism is to be established in the country, the existing government must be removed. They did that. And then Lenin says it's absolutely necessary for every communist party systematically to combine legal with illegal work, legal with illegal organization. Sabotage, assassination, and armed revolt are justified in order to replace an existing government with a communist government. Now, if you just let that sink in a little bit, those kind of tactics are acceptable behavior in order to create the communist state. Now, I find that fascinating in today's political climate because there are elements of our own government right now that are willing to do whatever it takes to overthrow the current system. Now, they're not asking for a communist revolution by any means, but they're trying to justify legal and illegal work in a higher cause, so to speak. So I just find that fascinating based off of historical theories. All right. All right, the vanguard. So Lenin and his small group of radical revolutionaries are the ones that are the vanguard. They are the leaders, the professionals that will lead the masses, right? The masses, they don't have the concept of this theory down, but these vanguard sure do, and they will tell you how it's going to be. So you probably should know the vanguard, and that's just Lenin and Trotsky, Stalin, amongst others. All right, and again, here's where it goes to the dark side, is the expansion. And this leads to the Cold War, basically, is what this evolves into. They insisted that the world consists of 2 camps, One camp is communist and the other camp is capitalist. The establishment of communism in one or more countries was not enough. It must establish it in all countries. So that leads to, after World War II, this Cold War, a bipolar world, communist communist countries influenced by the Russians, capitalist countries influenced by the United States. And we basically were fighting for control, if you will, ideological control of the world between the two sides. All right. So the 1922-ish, 1924, 24 is when Lenin dies. So after around that time, they actually create the Soviet Union, right? So this is the implementation of these Soviets, these communist terms, basically, within the communities. And then the Comintern is introduced 1919. So this world revolutionary movement is organized. Now it's going to be kind of a grassroots thing at the time, but regardless, between 1919 and 1935, the Comintern, its whole purpose in life was to influence other nations to move to communism. I think that might be it. It is. So this is the Russian model. Now China, which I'll probably just cover China Monday or Tuesday, is also, communist. Russia today, the fall of the Berlin Wall leads to the dissolving of the Soviet Union. So 1989, between 1989 and 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. And what is born of that, was this new version of kind of a hybrid, somewhat democratic, but not really. It basically turns into a one-party system in Russia. And now Putin, and I'll get to Putin probably tomorrow, kind of consolidates the power within Russia. So that's a different story. The communism, the true communism, is no longer part of Russia. Now it's more corruption and oligarchs, these super wealthy leaders within Russia that Putin controls. But that's what it's evolved into. The Chinese communism is somewhat based off of Marx, but then takes a different turn. And I'll get to that. That's some other down the road here. All right. Thank you for your time.